I'm standing in the barn, the dairy barn in East Arcade with a couple of cousins, Eddie Sawicki and Joe Gazelski. And I'm married to JoJo, the best move I ever made in my life. And got a team of horses hooked up here. Manure spreader, we're going out to deposit the manure for fertilizer purposes shortly. Anyway, my great-grandfather emigrated to this country in somewheres in the before World War I, 16, 15, 16, 17, somewheres in there. And he was basically, you know, escaping the draft because they knew what was coming. And there were 12 children in his family, and they were from the Alsace-Lorraine region of Germany. And there might have been another sibling or two that came with him. My sisters checked on this, but he ended up settling here in East Arcade, and he never spoke English, and I never owned any property. And he worked on this farm when he first came here, and he married a young lady named Mary Zahler from Varysburg, Johnsonsburg, which is here in Wyoming County. And they settled here in East Arcade, and at one time they lived in this house as tenants, and they lived in the house down the road, but never owned property. She passed away. Diabetes runs in the family. Luckily, I'm the only one who hasn't been afflicted by it. That's why I can continue to drink a lot of beer with my cousin Uncle Joe. And all of my grandfather's siblings all had it. They all died from it. My sister, my brother, two brothers all have it. My dad never had it, nor did my mother, who she wasn't obviously related to the Berwangers. But when my great-grandfather got so old he couldn't work, he lived right with my grandfather, who had bought the farm down the road, which was known as the Pine Tree Farm at the time. This farm is known as the Maple Park Farm. And so he lived there and did a few chores, mowed the lawn, did that kind of thing. And he passed away, and he's buried in Arcade at the Catholic Cemetery in Route 39 in the Main Street in Arcade. So my grandfather, he bought that farm and was very successful. Before he bought the farm, he was a conductor on the Arcade and Attica Railroad. Of course, he had lived here and worked on farms. He had a few brothers. Ray was a brother. August was a brother. And he had a sister, Nettie, who was married to a Don King, who's buried in the cemetery up here in East Arcade. My grandfather never wanted to be buried in East Arcade, even though he lived here his whole life, because it's wet where the cemetery is, and he didn't want to float the rest of his life. That's what he said. So he's buried down in Arcade where it's all gravel ground. So anyway, you know, he was successful. He came here. The farm was kind of in a shambles. He rebuilt it, started a dairy. My dad came along. My dad worked on the farm. My dad had one sister, Norma. My grandfather and grandmother, her name was Mary. Her nickname was May. They lived there until they died on the farm, and they never transferred it over to my dad. My dad, wanting to have his own place, bought this farm probably in 57, 58, and he sold the timber off. First thing he did, remodeled this barn so it could accommodate milkers, and we moved over here when I was 10 years old, and I've lived here my whole life until I hooked up with JoJo. So, and I still live here, basically. I spend more time here than I do any place. But, so my dad, we ran both farms for quite a while. We had well over 100 head, when 100 head was a huge number of cattle. And just the two of us, he and I, and you know, there were a number of things that happened. I went to college, and I came back, and I worked for the sheriff's department, and then I came back and worked on the farm, and been here ever since. I've worked a lot of other jobs, But here we are today, and now my son Ed, who's named after my grandfather Ed, my dad's dad, he owns the place, and I vowed that I wasn't going to take it with me. My dad vowed that he wasn't going to take it with me. Like my grandfather, he took it with him, and it ended up my grandmother at the end had to go into full-time nursing home care, and unfortunately that used up all the assets. At that time, I had just bought this farm from my dad, and I couldn't afford to buy that place. And I'm disappointed that that's how it happened, but that's life. So here we are today, standing in East Arcade. I'm drinking beer, Uncle Joe's drinking water, and Cousin Eddie, he's got a water right here. How's that, Eddie?
How about if we end with you doing a commercial, holding up the beer?
Smith's Beer, the #1 selling beer in East Arcade. I've drank a lot of it.
Excellent.